Okay, good. So let's see, I've been here at Crawford for 9 years. And over that period, I've worked with a large group of people, sort of an informal group, if you will, but people from Crawford, people from elsewhere at ANU, out other places in Australia and international as well. Steve Cork should be on this list, and I think I left you off, Steve. But he's definitely been part of this group. So it's not a complete list, but there's the work I'll be talking about is really the product of a much larger group around these three major themes. The idea of building integrated dynamic analysis and modeling of socio-ecological systems. How do we understand these systems in a much more integrated way, to model them, to value them? How do we manage these interdependent systems of humans and the rest of nature? And I put it that way very explicitly to make it clear that we're talking about not just humans separately from nature, but humans as a part of the whole interconnected system of humans, their societies, their economies, and the rest of nature. Secondly, how do we measure well-being within these complex systems? So the well-being not only of individual people, but the well-being of groups and societies and countries and the environment, sort of ecosystem health. How do we understand how these systems function, what makes them function well, and how do we measure that well-being in a more integrated way? So to get beyond GDP as our primary measure of progress toward something much more integrated. And finally, how do we create the future that we actually want? And in order to do that, I think we have to be able to envision that future and to build a shared vision of what that future could look like. And so there's been a lot of work around that. How do we do that envisioning exercise, scenario planning, and other sorts of processes? So I'll just touch on some of the things that we've done over these last 9 years around those themes. So since joining Crawford in 2013 on those themes, I've been an author or co-author of 98 journal articles, 6 books, 47 book chapters. There's been a lot of publications, including several popular articles expanding on these results. Part of the rationale and the reason and the urgency for doing this is that we now live in the anthropocene epoch, where human influence on the planet is really changing things, the climate, the nitrogen cycles. So we're having a major influence on the planet. So we can't continue with business as usual. And if we do really want to create a sustainable and desirable anthropocene, we need to think and act differently. And that's going to include, and that means the time is now to really build a different kind of economy based on a different goal of sustainable well-being of humans and the rest of nature, rather than the mindless pursuit of GDP growth. So this whole field of ecological economics, I think, is devoted to that sort of goal, around these three sub-goals of an ecologically sustainable scale, or staying within planetary boundaries, as it's called, a socially fair distribution of wealth and resources, both within the current generation, but also between the current and future generations of humans, and between humans and other species, and an economically efficient allocation beyond just the market allocation mechanism. How do we bring in resources and capital assets that are not marketed and probably shouldn't be marketed, but need to be efficiently allocated? So this book, the second edition of this Introduction to Ecological Economics, was one of the products of my time here at Crawford, in conjunction with Ida Kubashevsky, also at ANU, and Herman Daly and Richard Norgard, and a few others. Another major way of looking at the world from ecological economics point of view is that we have these 4 basic types of assets, including our sort of built capital assets, conventional types of capital, but also our human capital, individual people, their health, their resources, their education, our social capital, all of our interactions among people, our norms and rules and cultures and governments, and the market itself is a form of social capital, and our natural capital, everything else that we didn't have to produce. And how does those 4 types of assets interact to produce sustainable human well-being? Ecosystem services is the the contribution of natural capital in that interaction toward well-being. So as, from a paper that we published along those lines, that looked at how the value of those ecosystem services had changed from 1997, when we did an initial global assessment, to around 1911 in this case. And we found that, over that time period, because of changes in land use largely, desertification, loss of coral reefs, loss of tropical forests, we're losing about $20 trillion a year in terms of the value of those ecosystem services and their contribution to sustainable well-being. We've also done work over that time period to look at the future of ecosystem services under a range of different possible scenarios. Conventional business as usual scenarios and sort of a collapse scenario lead to worsening or a reduction in the continued reduction in the value of those ecosystem services. Policy reform could sort of stem the tide, but what we really need is a great transition sort of scenario that begins to restore, rebuild natural capital. And there's been a lot of work along those lines in terms of natural capital solutions to some of these problems and what that does contribute to human well-being. A more recent example is a study that we just finished on assessing the global value of coastal wetlands for storm protection. And again, this is with a large group of participants from around the world, but several from Sherilyn Anderson is one of our current PhD students. Paul Sutton was a visiting professor at the time. Ida Kubashevsky, and who else? That was it for this one. But based on a statistical analysis of historical storm tracks, and the location of coastal wetlands and the storm damages, et cetera, we managed to estimate from all of that, that the total annual avoided damages from having wetlands was about $450 billion a year globally. And we were able to then separate that out by country, and et cetera. So I think that will be very helpful in understanding part of the value of these coastal wetlands. And of course, that's just one of many ecosystem services that these wetlands provide. And a lot of our other work has been devoted to assessing some of those other values, sort of aggregating and using this sort of information in policy discussions. It also has to do with how do we manage these systems more effectively, and thinking of them more as common assets rather than as private assets, or even as state level assets. How do we build what you might call common asset trusts to steward these resources? And we published a paper recently, very recently in this case, on that whole idea. And it's being taken up now. That there was actually a bill proposed in the Vermont state legislature to create a state-level common asset trust. And we're currently working with Costa Rica to update their payment for ecosystem services system into a nationwide common asset trust. And this is all based on the ideas of Elinor Ostrom and her sort of core design principles for what do you need for sustainable commons management. What's a sort of list of characteristics that we can use to help design these kinds of institutions that would really have a better chance, I think, of managing these systems more sustainably and well for the benefit of everyone, including the humans and the rest of nature. And unfortunately, we're still using GDP a little too much, or misusing GDP, I guess, as a measure of progress. And even the creators, the architects of GDP, like Simon Kuznets, warned against that from the very beginning. GDP was never designed as a measure of societal progress. And if you're talking about growth of GDP or growth, you have to talk about growth of what and for what. And GDP is only measuring, marketed economic activity, and that has negative side effects, increasingly negative side effects. And so this is a paper we published along those lines. What are those negative side effects? What are some alternatives that could help us to understand what those are and measure them? and how do we begin to make sustainable progress? And in that paper, we listed some of the alternative measures. There are literally hundreds of them these days, but some modify GDP. I'll say a little bit more about the genuine progress indicator, which we've worked on a bit more. There's sort of direct surveys of life satisfaction, and there's a whole range of indices that put together different indicators like the OECD Better Life Index and the Human Development Index. The genuine progress indicator starts with personal consumption, a major component of GDP, but then weights it by income distribution. So it gets inequality into the mix, and the fact that a lot of our GDP these days is going to the top 1% of the top 1%, actually. So it's not really improving the well-being of everyone. It adds a few things that are left out, like the value of household labor and volunteer work. These things in the COVID epidemic have become much more obvious. And then it subtracts some things that really shouldn't be included as positives: the cost of crime, the loss of cost of water and air pollution, et cetera. So there's about 26 different elements that go into this. We did a global survey looking at all the countries that have estimated this kind of index, and came up with this sort of global assessment where GDP was growing over this whole time period up to about 2005 in this case. But after about 1980 or so, genuine progress had leveled off or began to decline because of increasing inequality, increasing environmental destruction, et cetera. So those negative side effects have outweighed all of the positive benefits from that increase in GDP. And I think that's a compelling result. And I think a few states have picked up on this idea in the US. Vermont and Maryland have adopted the GPI as one of their state indicators. There's actually a bill that's been proposed in the US Congress recently by Representative Omar from Minnesota to start calculating the GPI for the United States. There's still a long way to go there. GPI is not the perfect indicator of sustainable well-being, and I think we need to do a lot more in terms of modeling and measuring sustainable well-being. Here's one paper we published recently about some ideas on how to do that, to bring together in a more integrated way both the subjective and the objective indicators, and to really incorporate not only the damages to ecosystem services, but also the positive benefits and the positive benefits of social capital. But we've known these things for quite a while, actually. And so one question is, why haven't we been making progress more quickly? Will we ever make progress? And I think one way we've been looking at this is that the problem is that we really are addicted to this paradigm, this growth at all cost paradigm, to fossil fuels, to inequitable overconsumption in some countries, underconsumption in other countries. So how do we break out of that addiction? And so one paper that we published was trying to understand, well, what can we learn from what works to overcome addictions at individual scale to overcome this societal addiction to GDP growth at all costs. And it turns out that one of the therapies that's most effective, or quite effective at the individual scale, is something called motivational interviewing, which is based on not confronting addicts directly with their problem and saying, you've got to change, you got to stop doing this, you're really going to kill yourself. But instead having a positive discussion of their goals, their motives, their futures, what kind of life do they want for themselves in order to motivate that sort of change. So the obvious analogy here is, well, how do we build a shared vision in society of how do we have a positive discussion of our social goals and futures and motives? Can we do that? As the famous American baseball player and philosopher Yogi Berra once said, if you don't know where you're going, you end up somewhere else. How do we establish, where it is we're going? So a lot of the things we published are along those lines of how do we build this shared vision? This is a book that we published. Ida and I were editors of 45 different essays that we collected on different visions, different people's visions of what that future could look like. We know that the SDGs are a major step in that direction. This is the first time, I think, in human history that all the countries in the world have agreed on a broad set of goals like this. that include I think all of the things that we would all agree go into this, some kind of sustainable well-being. We want to eliminate poverty and hunger. We want to deal with climate change. We want to protect our marine and terrestrial resources. We want to reduce inequality, renewable energy, etc. But how do you get that vision across, beyond the policy community? We know that we want to stay within planetary boundaries. You've probably seen some version of this paper that we've also been involved with, or that idea. But we also want to produce all the elements of well-being and quality of life. We want to stay in the donut, as it's been called by Kate Rayworth. So how do we build that shared vision? One idea that works well in a lot of contexts is this idea of scenario planning. We can't create the future, we can't predict the future, but we can create the kind of future that we want. But to do that, we have to establish, what we really want. And scenario planning, lays out plausible futures that we can look at and compare and say, well, of these plausible futures, not to say which one's most likely, but say which ones are plausible. And of that range of plausible futures, which ones do we really prefer? This is based on the work of the Great Transition Initiative, and it's sort of an archetypical way of displaying plausible futures. They often fall into these four different categories. The Great Transition future, I think, corresponds roughly with the kind of thing that you would like to see in the SDGs. So one thing we did was to create a version of that for Australia, changing the terminology a little bit to make it be a little less value laden. And then had a public opinion survey with more than 2,000 sort of participants, and asked them to read about what these futures would look like, and then rank them and give us their preferences. And here's the results of that. They said that the community well-being scenario, the SDG kind of scenario, was ranked number 1 or 2 by over 72% of the community. Difficulty in doing this kind of thing is it's hard to convey in a short description, of bullet points. We had sort of a news blast from the future to describe these alternative futures, but you need to do something a little more engaging, I think, to really get people thinking about these alternative futures. And we've been working with a filmmaker recently, Gaiman Gameau. I don't know if you've seen the film 2040, where he does a sort of positive vision of the near-term future. But how do we get filmmakers and the humanities and the arts community more engaged in trying to describe what those futures could look like? What would the world look like if we did achieve the SDGs? And can we use that to help motivate movement in that direction? And we also, I think, ultimately are going to need a large global civil society alliance to make the kind of transition that we're looking for. And so one thing we've been involved with is building this Wellbeing Economy Alliance, started at a meeting in Glasgow in 2017, hosted by Nicola Sturgeon, who's the First Minister. And the idea there is, that there are lots of people around the world, I think, thinking similar thoughts, but they're not really coordinated. How do we get them all together, both at the government level, but also at the NGO level, at the individual level, at the academic level? So that's what the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is trying to do. There's a government group. There's a really good TED Talk you could take a look at by Nicola Sturgeon, describing what they're trying to do. And here's the website where you could learn more about what the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is doing and join. There's also an Australian hub of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance that's just recently been formed. And they have a whole range of ideas that they're pulling together on how to build a well-being economy. You know that New Zealand was one of the founding members of this well-being economy governance group, along with Scotland, Iceland, Wales. Finland has joined. I think Costa Rica is on the verge of joining. So the idea would be, instead of the G7, we would have the We7 or the We20 of governments that are really committed to this broader idea of well-being rather than simply GDP growth. Okay, thanks very much. And I think that was about not too long, and hopefully you have time for a lot of questions. And before I turn it over to that, I'm going to put this on the screen because somebody just sent this to me, which is representative, I think, of Australia's approach to dealing with the climate problem. While you're thinking about questions.
Thank you, Bob, for that wonderful talk. As people gear up with their question, may I ask you to share key themes that you see evolving in sustainable well-being economies at this COP26?
Well, at COP26, I heard that the United States and China had agreed or have a sort of side agreement to do more. And I think those two countries are probably key in really making progress, and China in particular these days. So I think and China, I think, is an interesting situation because they have committed to building what they call an ecological civilization. And if they take that seriously and begin to understand, I think, some of the principles that we've been talking about, then I think there's some real possibilities for a good future. And yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think there is a question from Anna, or maybe a comment. So Anna, would you like to talk about that?
Oh, well, thanks, Ms. Hami. Thanks, Robert. That was a fascinating talk, and I'm really impressed how you managed to condense in 15 minutes a lifetime of achievements. Just looking at your scenarios, like the one you concentrated on, like the community well-being, there's some of those messages resonate with some of the philosophers in like the mid-20th century. So it's not a question, it was just like a comment to like, what have we learned from past efforts to have that like shared well-being and less consumption? What have we learned from history that we're not going to repeat this time?
That's a good question. Do you have an answer? Well, I think my only point there, was that I think we can point to some historical cases where having a shared vision is what really motivated some cultural changes and things that were fairly, kinds of addictive behavior. We can think of even smoking, as a case study, where we knew for quite a long time that smoking was bad for people's health, for their individual health, and for society's health more broadly. But the reason that nothing changed was the influence of the parties that stood to gain from continuing that behavior, the smoking industry. But what it took to overcome that, I think, was a really, class action lawsuits, really a sort of a civil society in conjunction with the legal system, in conjunction with the government, recognizing that that was not a good situation, that we needed to really change that. So I think we're beginning to see that convergence now with the climate problem. But I think it's going to take integrating the climate solutions with the solutions to all of the other integrated problems. I mean, the problem with climate is partly the problem with how we run our economies, how we deal with our societies, what our fundamental goal is for society. A lot of what's being talked about is, well, how do we solve this climate problem without having to change anything about GDP or the way we run our economies? And I'm not sure that's really going to work. I think what we have to do is think about, well, what's our real goal for the system? Our real goal is sustainable well-being, or at least it should be. And I think if you ask most people in the world about their goals, through this sort of scenario envisioning exercise, you do sort of come to that conclusion. The problem is, how do we get from here to there? How do we overcome that addiction? What's the right therapy? And like I said, the therapy for addictions it doesn't often work to confront the addicts directly with their problem. that's often counterproductive. So you have to sort of, and that's what we've been doing, you know, in the climate front and the environmental community in general. Not that it's not true in both cases. It's absolutely true that, you know, that if we don't change our behavior, we're headed for disaster. But that doesn't motivate people to change their behavior. So what's the right therapy? And that's what we've been trying to discover. And hopefully this focus on, you know, building a shared vision, getting that discussion out to I think actually that's what democracy should be all about, is building a shared vision among the people about what goals we're trying to pursue. And, you know, and that will motivate the right kinds of policy. Without that shared vision, I think we're just going off in all the different directions. I don't know if that answers the question at all, but thanks.
Thank you, Bob. I think next we have Keith. Over to you, Keith.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks for your talk. And it's been a pleasure to have you as a colleague in the RE&D group over the last 8 or 9 years. So my question relates to politics, I guess, and how ecological economics as a discipline, and maybe also you and your team as people working in this area sort of grapple with this issue of politics. And sometimes it seems to me that you know, the discussions around shared visions and scenarios, you know, assumes everybody's living in a deliberative democracy, when, you know, it seems as though actually the opposite is happening, and the world is democracies in decline in many places, and sort of authoritarian systems are on the rise. You know, this also relates to the Sustainable Development Goals, which I know that you prioritize. I've just been reading a fascinating thesis by a young lady from Laos who did a study of how, you know, the authoritarian regime in Laos has sort of manipulated the Sustainable Development Goals to reflect the, you know, the priorities and the interests of the single party state system there, both in terms of its implementation and what they're measuring and things like that. So I guess the question is, yeah, you know, how do you think about this problem of, you know, the alignment between ecological economics and democracy, and do you think that's an area that the field is trying to grapple with, or, you know, any further reflections on that from your side would be welcome.
Well, you know, political systems are obviously very important in terms of what happens in the world. And I think authoritarian regimes are ways of imposing, you know, the vision of a small subset of society on everyone else, you know, through various means of coercion and force. And in the end, I think, I mean, theoretically, you could envision, you know, a benevolent dictator who really had the well-being of the whole society, you know, as their goal, being able to do that effectively. But usually it turns out that authoritarian regimes, you know, benefit only the ruling class, you know, the parties in power. Even democracies these days are not that far away from that, in that, you know, they're really plutocracies. They're not really, you know, engaging with the population. They're dictating to the population, you know, via the media, via other mechanisms, what people should want. So I think in the end, if we want a truly sustainable well-being world, it's going to have to be more democratic, in the sense that it's going to have to consider the well-being of the whole demos, the whole population, and not the well-being of only a small subset. You know, and growing inequality has certainly, you know, moved us away from that goal, because then it's the small 1% or, you know, 0.1% of the population who control the way things go, and it's you know, it's for their benefit, not for the benefit of everyone. Yeah, I guess the ecological economics approach is, well, how do you make things more truly democratic? And I think the whole idea of deliberative democracy is an interesting approach to that. And even in China, I've heard that they are using deliberative democracy kinds of processes to a certain extent to sort of understand the way people are thinking. But I think it would behoove us to try to improve democracies around the world, even in the democracies that are kind of in name only these days. If our shared goals are really that, and how these political changes occur, often it does take a broader social movement. So if we can engage the larger population in thinking about the future they want, and then using that unified force, united we stand, and we could elect a different set of political leaders if that's possible, and if not, sort of move things in the right direction through other means. So,
thanks, Bob.
Okay, so we have Timo Koskimaki. Would you like to go ahead?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Hi, Timo.
Hi, Bob. So I wanted to ask you that during your career, what has been the reaction from other scholars overall on the ideas that you have researched? I was specifically thinking about valuing nature and questioning GDP and focusing on well-being as the primary societal goal.
Well, the good scholars have been very positive, and the others have not. So, yeah, that's my short answer. I don't know. There's always a range of opinion on these sorts of topics, and I think part of what we're doing is trying to raise issues and raise questions. Not to say this is the way the world is or should be, but how do we think about it differently, and how do we how do we discuss these things? Certainly, the idea that natural systems, natural ecosystems, contribute to human well-being in very complex ways that we have not been valuing sufficiently. I think that idea has gotten broad acceptance these days. And there will always be issues about, well, how do we understand those connections? How do we value those connections? Blah, blah, blah. And I think that's all good. So the research in this area has just, exploded, I think. And there's lots of different opinions. But I don't think there's any one right way to value these ecosystem services, but there is a wrong way, and that was what we were doing, which was not to value them at all. So I think we made a lot of progress in that regard. In terms of the GDP, I think there's growing, I guess, agreement that that we need to move beyond GDP. As I said, even in the U.S., there's a bill pending, to start measuring the genuine progress indicator in the U.S. And a couple of U.S. states have done that. But I think across a whole range of disciplines, that there's recognition that GDP, it's an obvious thing once you look at it. GDP was never designed to measure societal progress, and we're just misusing it. It's not that we shouldn't be calculating GDP. It's an interesting, it's good to know, but you have to know what it's measuring and why it's not really the right thing to be pursuing at all costs. It's got to be taken in the right context, and I think that message is hopefully getting across. Although sometimes it's hard to see that, and at meetings like the COP as well, you sort of see that coming out in some of the political decisions you see here in Australia and elsewhere. Like we can't do anything to reduce coal production and consumption because that will have a huge impact on GDP. Well, so what? That could be a good thing, given that you can make the transition more smoothly, in a more just way. You don't want to put people, immediately out of work, but we could certainly transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewables, in a way that employs more people in more satisfying jobs than they have now. So I think that gets back to the addiction metaphor too, because I think what's keeping us from making that transition is the fossil fuel sector, who have sunk assets that they're trying to protect. And, it's not in their narrow best interest to make that transition, but it is definitely in society's broader self-interest. And yeah, we need to overcome that addiction.
So maybe as a follow-up, if the reaction from academia has mainly been positive and it has encouraged more research on these topics, have you had any feedback from society or these industries? Have you been interacting with them about these ideas during your career?
Yeah, quite a bit. So maybe one area that's interesting right now is this whole idea of regenerative agriculture and the need for the agriculture sector really to start looking more at ecosystem services more broadly, carbon sequestration specifically, but I think more broadly the whole range of things. And so we have a linkage grant that we've been working on with partnering with NAB and GIZ. That's building a model to try to understand how does this regenerative agriculture work, not just in the short term but in the longer term. Can they use that sort of information to help decide who to loan money to and to inform farmers on kinds of behaviors that they could change in order to be more regenerative. We're not going to solve the climate problem just by reducing emissions at this point. I think we're also going to have to increase sequestration quite a bit, and agriculture is certainly one of the main areas that could help there, along with reforestation and other sorts of rebuilding our natural capital assets. So
you're helping them find solutions to problems that they are facing, seeking solutions to.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So we have some chats here. So I will take them in the order that they were raised. So first from Rod Keenan. Would you like to go ahead, Rod? Or should I just read out from the chat?
Hi. Yeah. Hi, Bob.
Hi.
Thanks for the talk. Yeah, I really admired your work over the years. Yeah, I just saw a headline in The Guardian this morning from George Monbiot that, to solve the climate problem, we need to make wealth history. And just wonder whether that's the right path to be going down.
So, sorry, to solve the climate problem, we need to make wealth history? What?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
It's a good headline, but I'm just wondering whether it's...
Well, does that mean to reduce? Does that mean reduce inequality? Is that his intention?
Yeah, I haven't read the article, but I guess what he's saying is a redistribution and more. Some of Piketty's ideas, I guess, the tax on capital, and some of those. I think Elizabeth Warren and others are also suggesting that in the US that there should be taxes on capital and redistribution.
Yeah, no, I totally agree that we need a much more equitable system if our goal is really, sustainable well-being for the maximum number of people. And like I said, we have dictatorships not only in name but also in de facto with too much wealth concentration. So and I think a more democratic approach would help to level that wealth maldistribution and make everybody better off. It turns out, there's been a lot of work on the impacts of inequality on a whole range of social problems, the work of Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, you probably come across. But, it shows that, better wealth distribution would be better even for the wealthy, because it's not making them any happier. They're just spending all their time trying to keep up with the other wealthy people, and the side effects are what's damaging everybody. So they could be just as happy competing with each other, if we tax them at very high rates. And some of them actually said that. Yeah, go ahead, tax the hell out of us. It doesn't matter. What they're pursuing is just their status within the wealthy. and if their status is based on gross income, you could tax away 90% of that, and it would still be just as much fun for them, if you will. So, but making that transition is the difficult part. Sorry,
but I guess just making the middle class richer doesn't necessarily make us all more sustainable. So there needs to be other factors brought in, I guess, to try and deal with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the other factors are the sort of whole positive psychology area, like what actually does contribute to people's well-being, and consumption, of things that you buy on the market is a small fraction of that. You need enough, but you don't need to go overboard. And yet the media, and the whole system basically encourages people to buy more, and convinces them that they're not happy unless they have the latest thing to buy. And that's just not the case when it comes to people's actual well-being. So making that point, I think, a little more clearly, if we could trade all of the stuff that we already have to each other and be just as happy as if we had to go out and buy new stuff and throw away the old stuff. And, that's becoming a movement as well. The whole buy nothing movement. Don't buy something new, find somebody who already has it and that wants to give it away, and we'll just trade all of the stuff we've already created and be just as happy. But that goes against the whole GDP growth at all costs sort of paradigm. So guess what? It's all connected.
Yeah. Thanks, Bob.
Sure.
Yeah, so the next I have is Tom Compass. Would you like to go?
Yeah, thanks very much. I wasn't able, Bob, how are you? Good to see you.
I'm really good. How are you, Tom? Good to see you.
Yeah, good. I couldn't get the link to work until quite late, so I missed much of your talk. But let me say, I love your work. It was a great pleasure having you in Crawford, and as the former director of the school, I'm very sorry to see you go. But of course, wish you all the best.
Thank you.
I interrupted you, but I've got a quick question. I'm not sure what exactly you said during your talk, but I understand GDP can be an issue, and it has a lot of problems associated with it. But what often tends to happen is that people like Jason Hickel and others just sort of go really in the opposite direction and say less is more, GDP must fall, no growth in GDP. I just sort of wonder how you feel, where you place yourself on this spectrum in terms of green growth. I mean, is it possible to have increases in GDP that aren't harmful, that don't disadvantage, poor people, and given the fact that we have population growth, holding GDP constant could be problematic without significant redistribution. So just wondering where you are on that spectrum.
I think I'm in the A growth camp rather than the D growth or pro growth, or that GDP measures something that is interesting to know, but it's certainly not, that shouldn't be our goal. GDP is a means to an end. It's not the end, and it's only one means to an end. It's not the only means. And that, I think, has been the misuse of GDP. This idea that it's a proxy for well-being, and improving GDP is going to help solve all the other problems. Not necessarily. It could in some cases, but in other cases, our economies are obese and we need to go on a GDP diet, or somehow reduce, because we're just producing and consuming things in the wrong way or too much with the wrong side effects, the side effects of increasing inequality. That's not the right way to, we could produce the same amount of GDP and distribute it much more equitably and have much better influence on well-being. But that's not what you get out of just the GDP measure. So you have to worry about inequality, you have to worry about environmental impacts. And if GDP also goes up or down, when you've made those adjustments, then so be it. But it's just not something we want to use as our primary goal. I think that's the problem.
Yeah, no, that's well put. What about the argument that it's really just population growth that's the problem? Certainly in terms of biodiversity loss and land use change and so on.
Well, I go back to the Paul Ehrlich, IPAT equation. It's population times consumption, moderated by technology. So, all else being equal, more people are going to consume more, but that's not necessarily the case, because if we had a more equitable distribution and if we changed the way we produce and consume things, you could have the same number of people consuming a lot less or more. So it's really, you have to look at the whole system and not just one factor at a time, like population or consumption or technology. And that unfortunately is what we do too much of, is we do all these things from silos, and each silo has their own thing that they're focused on, and that's what they study without looking at the connections between everything else. And that's where the real solutions, I think, are going to come, is that more integrated, more transdisciplinary approach, and a more sort of cooperative approach, a more co-production approach. And a more democratic approach.
Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. I appreciate it. Thanks for that, Bob, and good luck in London, for sure.
Thank you. You'll come visit, I'm sure.
Oh, I will. For sure.
Yeah, so we have next Anna with her comment.
Thanks.
Hi,
if
Anna.
anyone else wants to say something, I don't want to take over the conversation. But if anyone else has questions, so Bob, with all the work that you've done at a global level, do you know of any studies that have looked at the question whether, with the current carrying capacity of the globe, if everyone was to live sustainably in our consumption and our standard of living was to be equally distributed, what would be the average standard of living in terms of our diet, our clothing, education, house sizes, transport?
Uh-huh.
And the big question there is, all of us who are living way above that limit, are we all prepared to go down to a sustainable level of lifestyle for all?
Yeah. Well, I think key there is, does reducing your consumption actually reduce your well-being? And I think you can reduce your consumption of conventional goods and services quite a bit without reducing your overall well-being. And comparisons among countries, show that when you look at life satisfaction surveys across countries, Costa Rica often ranks in the top 10, and yet their GDP per capita is something like $10,000 a year. And our international comparison of GPI and GDP show that there's a real peak at somewhere around that number of around $10,000 or so dollars per year, U.S. equivalent. And so beyond that, a lot of the consumption is not really necessary to improve well-being. It's just status, it's status competition, essentially. So if you could eliminate that, you could say, well, yes, we could all live a much better life, actually, if there was contraction and convergence, increasing in some places, decreasing in others, towards something more around the sweet spot of, and I don't know where exactly it is, and it probably varies from country to country as well, but it's probably a lot less than what we have in most developed countries. And also, more equitably shared internally among the population in countries, but also between countries. So that whole idea of equity and fairness, I think is a key factor in creating this sustainable and desirable future.
We have a few ticos there.
How much what?
Ticos.
From ticos, yes. Yeah. Pura vida.
Something?
Well, they have a saying there, pura vida, the pure life. That's what they're after. If you have good social relationships, if you have enough food and alcohol and coffee, in that case, then life is good. So I think that's an important idea, though. People in the developed countries are being told that this is all going to be a huge sacrifice. We're going back to the dark ages. They're going to have to give up everything and make do. In fact, I think you can paint a scenario, where that is just not the case. where people's lives are actually better, more fulfilling, but not so focused on consumption and status competition. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Maybe we will have time just for one last comment or question. I think there is one by Marcelo.
Marcelo, there's a Tico for you.
And Celeste, sorry if I am getting the names wrong pronounced, but yeah, if you would like to go ahead and make your comment or question.
Oh, hey, well, I didn't have any questions. Sorry, I was just writing in the chat box that we were able to reverse deforestation while increasing our GDP. So that was a good example, and I know all of the Ticos are very proud of that. And Bob has also been instrumental in helping us with that as well.
And Costa Rica has no army, by the way. So, reducing defense spending, I think could really go a long way to improving, and what they spent the money on in Costa Rica is education and, social programs. And so how we spend, our government resources, I think can make a big difference in terms of how well off the population is. Right, Marcelo?
Yes, sir. Amen to that.
Pura vida.
Pura vida, Bob. Glad that we're going to have you closer to Costa Rica.
A little bit. Not that much, actually.
Well, you're getting closer, man. So.
But Rob, in a country like Australia, where we've done such a bad job at COP26, just spending billions of dollars in submarining, and I 100% agree with everything what you said, and I would move to Costa Rica in a heartbeat. But realistically, how are we going to make the transition in a country like Australia, where we are so dependent for our jobs and everything on the use of natural resources?
Well, because Australia could be a major, renewable energy exporter. That idea has been floated there. We have a lot of sunshine, a lot of wind, a lot of area that could be used for solar panels. So if that's what Costa Rica, that's what Australia should be doing, is focusing on how do we move all of those jobs that are currently in mining, and they're not that many actually. The number of jobs in mining and fossil fuels are minuscule compared to other things. So it could be a very positive move into the whole renewable energy production sector. So that's where the money should be going. I heard that the plan was to spend $100 billion on nuclear powered submarines. So that's a lot of money that could be better spent, I think. What really is going to be and the first one would not even come online until 2040. I think it's some really, really bad decisions at the government level. However, the state governments in Australia, I think, are doing much better. The federal government is going in the opposite direction in cases from the state governments. The ACT, Western Australia, Tasmania, Victoria, I think they're all doing a lot of positive things. And in fact, there's a movement to try to engage those state governments in the Wellbeing Economy Governments Alliance. Hopefully that will happen. And again, you got to recognize that the therapy takes time, and there are going to be relapses, and it's not something you're going to solve overnight. So we have to look at these things from that perspective. It's not like we can jump from here to there immediately. You've got to plot out. First, you have to decide what is the goal, and then you have to decide, okay, how do we get from here to that better goal? Right now, we don't have the goal firmly in mind, or at least broadly enough shared. Once we've established that, then I think the path will can begin to reveal itself.
Thank you, Bob, for a very wonderful talk, and we wish you a very a good future and a good year.
Thank you. Good to see you all. Thanks, guys.